Good evening, it's Friday night. It's David in the Magic Library getting ready to read our last installment of Voodoo Days at La Casa Fabulosa. If you're out there, check in and say hi. Let us know where you're from. Hey, Justin Davis and Laura. Good to see you. Laura Vance Calhoun and Beth. And Thomas Evers, good to see you. And Devin. Yeah, say hi to everyone. There's Wendy. Wendy and Lori are in Slade with their respective others. There's Sylvia, and is Olivia with you tonight? Karen, Sheila Marie Wall, so welcome. It's our last night reading Voodoo Days at La Casa Fabulosa. So if you were here last night, you know that the main story kind of ended. I finally came into contact with Josephine and tried to talk to her, but it turns out it wasn't Josephine. It was someone else. Was there ever a Josephine? That's the question. We found out all the strange things in the house centered around the maid's bedroom, and we kind of surmised that if there was a ghost in the house, it might have been the maid that worked there at one time. And so at our last dinner party that we read about in the book, Wendy led us through the house, did a kind of blessing over the place, and from that point forward, we never had any more problems at La Casa Fabulosa. We were there for another 7 years after that. But what else? Yeah, that was, I think, pretty much it. So tonight, hey, Deanna and Kenneth and cousin Lisa and Becky. Yeah, so tonight we're going to read the epilogue. Kind of brings people up to speed on what happened after that first year or two in the house. So thanks again for tuning in. I went to vodka tonight. I'm doing a vodka gimlet, so cheers everyone. And let us know what you're drinking. So Friday night, hope you all had a good day. Looking forward to the weekend. It was a nice day here in Louisville. It was cloudy on and off, but for the most part, it was a pretty day. All right. So, Jamie, if you missed the last couple nights, go to my Facebook page, and you can find all the previous broadcasts, and they will all go to the Louisville Historic Tours YouTube channel as well. And yeah, we're working on the T-shirts, Glenda, and reunions and hobo stuff. So, like I said, we're finishing this tonight, but tune in tomorrow night. I'll find some more stuff to read. I think I'll probably start to read a bit of my true crime book that I'm working on, give you a preview. And then maybe we'll do my murder mystery that's set in old Louisville, but I'm not done, so we won't be able to finish that, okay? So once again, we're kind of homebound, so I can't be out on the streets of old Louisville taking people around, telling stories. Hey, Maria. And so next best thing, hey, Steve. And Steve sent me a big box of smoked meat and sausage today. That was a nice surprise. So I got bacon and sausages and liverwurst, all kinds of great stuff. So thanks for that, Steve. But yeah, so the next best thing is for me to get online and talk about Old Louisville. Old Louisville is one of the largest historic preservation districts in the neighborhood. Hey, Lori. And 48 square blocks of old houses, 1,400 structures and all. There's going to be some stories there, so with some of my books, that's kind of what I strive to do, tell the stories that are down in old Louisville. The stories in the past, many of them spooky, but the stories today, what's going on in the neighborhood and what kind of people are living there and why they're talking about the neighborhood and excited about it. So don't worry, we're going to have a lot of time yet to still promote the neighborhood. So T-shirts and stuff are coming, so just keep tuning in. I shared some pictures on Facebook today, but if Beth or Laura or Wendy, you've got access to any of the pictures you shared with me, share some in the comments so people can see some of the pictures of the inside of the house and some of the goofy parties we used to have. So without further ado, we're going to do our final reading of Voodoo Days at La Casa Fabulosa, an unconventional memoir. So, epilogue. The buzz of the cicadas was deafening. The neighborhood was wilting in the stranglehold of the sweltering heat of the last day of August in 2007. Fall was just still 3 weeks away. As I worked way down from the top floor of La Casa Fabulosa down to the front door. All the furniture had been moved out several days before, and my footsteps echoed in hollow thuds as I passed from one empty room to the next. Void of furniture, rugs, and drapery, the 3-story building had resumed the imposing mien that had greeted us almost 8 years before. Unobstructed by the clutter of everyday life, I was free to confront the memories that had sought refuge in each of the vacant spaces. Images of get-togethers and dinner parties, friends and family who had come to visit, countless hours of renovation and work, unnerving nights plagued by unseen footfall during the first year. It was time to leave Widmer House, but it wasn't Lucy who had caused us to flee. No, it was something much more frightening. It was a subprime mortgage. After more than a year of struggling, we had finally realized that the time had come to let the old house go. Worried that it might fall into the hands of someone who wouldn't give her the attention she deserved, I was happy to discover that someone who had read about the house in my first book, Ghosts of Old Louisville, was in the market for a haunted house. He was especially intrigued by Lucy's story and promised to carry on the good work. When I talked to the new owner several months after he moved in, he mentioned strange noises and odd footsteps around 3:30 a.m. had been keeping him awake, and that his cats were acting strange. I kept in touch with him for the first several years, and we'd email every several months, and then I started to hear less and less from him. The front yard became overgrown, and tendrils of ivy began creeping across the facade of La Casa Fabulosa. The gold leaf and gilding on the facade started to fade, and chips of paint flaked away here and there. In addition, several major windstorms had wreaked havoc on the city, and one day, not too long ago, as I drove by La Casa Fabulosa, I noticed one of the chateau finials was missing from the roofline. Very recently, a former neighbor informed me that the new owner had vanished and that nobody in the neighborhood knew what had become of him. As far as they could tell, the house was abandoned and empty. Little by little, La Casa Fabulosa was starting to look more and more like a haunted house. One day, right before moving out, I received an unexpected visit from an elderly lady who knocked and said her grandmother had been one of the first owners of the house. The woman asked to come in and see the place, and I was more than happy to oblige her. As I showed her from room to room and listened to comments about what changes had taken place and how she approved of the decorating, I grew anxious to hear her comments when we reached Lucy's room at the back of the house. Sure enough, she confirmed that the maid had indeed lived in that room, but other than that, she couldn't recall anything in particular about the individual. Her grandmother, she said, complained that bats always seemed to be flying around the house, day or night. When I asked if she remembered the maid's name, the old woman shook her head and said she couldn't recall it for sure, but she said it might have been something like Lizzie. Lizzie? Lucy? They're very similar, so I wondered if the stories about Lucy were true after all. Standing there in the foyer near the wall where pictures had kept falling for no apparent reason, I pressed the old lady for more information. One thing she did remember, she informed me, was that her grandmother's maid had come to her as a young girl, and that even though the woman was very fond of the servant, she always complained about her mischievousness. With a chuckle, the old woman told how her grandmother was constantly chiding the girl for eavesdropping when visitors came. Instead of staying out of sight in the back part of the house as servants did, the young girl liked to sneak to the small landing on the front staircase and listen to conversations in the parlor, making sure she stayed just out of sight in case someone exited the parlor and discovered her perched there. I thought about the times I had heard footsteps on those very stairs, and I wondered if the mischievous young housekeeper had wanted to eavesdrop and nothing more. Each time I had the distinct impression that someone was trying very hard to stay out of sight. Was La Casa Fabulosa haunted by the ghost of a former servant named Lucy or Lizzie? Or was it all merely a series of strange coincidences? Personally, I've chalked a lot of it up to just having an overactive imagination and a good deal of happenstance, but you never know. Although I don't have nearly as many voodoo days as during that first year in Widmer House, every once in a while a spate of coincidences will pop up and make me think. One morning, not too long ago, for example, I woke up chuckling after having a dream about possums. And I went downstairs, made my coffee, and I turned on the TV, and the channel that was on was running a documentary about possums. A few minutes later, as I stood at the back window, looking into the stand of trees that separates our yard from the neighbor's, I noticed a baby possum hanging upside down from its tail. After a minute or two, it swung up and grabbed the next branch before scampering away into the leafy canopy. Later that afternoon, as I returned home from a round of errands, I found myself in a minor traffic jam because something had blocked the traffic about a block from my house. After craning my head out the window, I discovered that cars in both lanes of traffic had stopped to let something cross the road. At first, I thought it was a cat or a dog, but once the traffic started moving again, and I was able to see the creature creeping over the sidewalk and into a well-manicured lawn, I discovered that it was a possum. Not only that, she had 6 babies riding on her back, and before rounding the corner of a house and disappearing from sight, she turned and looked at me. At that very moment, the second when our eyes met, all of her offspring lifted their heads, and they did the same, and I caught my breath, and I had to smile to see her face sweetly framed by those of her children. I was left pondering how many times in their busy daily routines most people are fortunate enough to go about their day and find out that a traffic jam is due to the crossing of a mother possum with young ones on her back. And I came to the conclusion that it was probably a very rare occasion, and I considered myself very lucky. Speaking of possums, I finally captured the last family of fat possums in the basement and set them free out in the East End when the weather warmed up. And none too soon either. Bess had discovered a gap in the heating grate from the basement to the kitchen, and she learned that she could drop her doggy treats through it to her possum friends below. Our little black cat, unfortunately, never did return to her little closet under the stairs. I'm sure someone in the neighborhood took her in. That's how people are in old Louisville. Sadly, the dogs are no longer with us either. In 2004, Fritz developed problems with his throat, and after half a year of visits to specialists and unsuccessful operations, we had to have him put to sleep. When my first book of ghost stories came out the following year, I made sure to dedicate it to him in memory of the many nights he sat next to me as I worked on the manuscript in the front parlor. And in 2010, we lost Rocky and Bess, both at the age of 14. Rocky developed kidney issues and Bess had a stroke. I dedicated the next 2 ghost books to them. The same year, we also had to have Edwin put to sleep. He was another little rescue schnauzer we had adopted in the meantime, and he had congestive heart failure. Losing 3 dogs in 1 year was hard, and we haven't gotten around to adopting new ones since then. I have missed having furry companions, though, and maybe it's about time to see about getting another batch of schnauzers. For some reason, though, Ramon has it in his head that we should get a golden doodle instead of schnauzers. But I've been stubborn, and I told him I only want schnauzers. He's persistent, though, and he keeps saying he wants a golden doodle. He insists that if people see me walking down the streets with a golden doodle, I will look like less of a hobo. Look, I think that's our last hobo, so cheers to the hobos. So now we live in a different part of town, not far from old Louisville, but I miss living among the big old mansions and the eccentrics and oddballs in that enchanted neighborhood. Around the corner from my current house, a cozy stone cottage from the 1940s, is a large park where I go for daily walks. Sometimes, when I can't sleep or I have things on my mind, I get up very early and I take my stroll while it's still dark outside. Or if the urge strikes me, I'll jump out of bed in the wee hours of the morning, often at 3 or 4, and I'll head over to the park and follow the path to the top of the hill, which is crowned by an imposing brick structure built as a mansion in 1944, after the 154-year-old original burnt to the ground. Nearby, I find a tree, usually one looking down the hill and across the bottom half of the park, and I sit underneath it. It's not quite the same as Central Park at night, but it's an inspiring experience nonetheless. That's when deer steal forth from the adjacent forest and they play on the meadow, and owls in the treetops hoot back and forth to each other. And if I wait long enough, raccoons venture down from the branches and they continue their nighttime quests for food. I see a fox every now and then, and many possums. Very rarely will I spy another human creature of the night, and if I do, I always remain quiet and hidden in the shadows so I don't startle anyone. And even if I do see someone on a very late night stroll, they're never pushing creaky shopping carts, although, strangely enough, I did spy one the other day at the bottom of the creek that cuts through the park. In old Louisville, shopping carts aren't much of a problem anymore. Not too long after my first book came out, the Winn-Dixie at the corner of 4th and Crazy closed its doors, and it went out of business, so there went half of the rogue shopping carts in the neighborhood. Then, finally giving in to complaints and neighborhood demands, the Kroger on 2nd Street implemented a wheel locking system to prevent shopping cart theft from their store, and now, thankfully, abandoned shopping carts on the street of Old Louisville are something of a novelty. Just recently, however, the 2nd Street Kroger went on the market with an asking price of $1.6 million, so who knows how much longer it will be around. The rumor is that Old Louisville will be losing its only grocery store very soon. Whatever goes in there, everybody will still call it the Krogetto. Sometimes a wave of nostalgia will overcome me, and I'll wake up in the middle of the night and drive 10 minutes to Old Louisville and find a tree in Central Park and sit under it. Invariably, there are people who wander by at all hours of the night, but as I push my spine up against the trunk of the tree in an attempt to stay hidden from them in the shadows, my ears will strain to hear the rattling wheels of a rusty shopping cart bumping along the sidewalk. The real sound never materializes, though, and I'm left reminiscing about the good old days in La Casa Fabulosa. Although we don't have our get-togethers every week like we used to, that tradition still carried on till well after we moved out of La Casa Fabulosa. But I still see most of the old friends on a regular basis. We still love to sit around and tell stories whenever we're together. As far as I can tell, this new place doesn't have ghosts or weird things associated with it, but I did have a strange experience right after we moved in. We had only been there a couple of weeks, and it was the Thursday before Derby weekend. I came home in the evening after teaching most of the day, and when I pulled into our street, there were cars parked all over the place because a neighbor was throwing a party. We now live on a very narrow, hilly street, and I was amazed to see so many cars lined up on our side. And when I came home that night, I wondered if there would be problems with the cars getting past each other. After I went to bed around midnight and saw that the cars still lined the street, I wondered how long the party would last. Several hours later, at 3:30 to be precise, I awoke because a knocking was coming from downstairs. At first, I lay there in bed asking myself if I had really heard a knocking or if it was something else, but then the knocking came again and it became clear that somebody was at the front door, which was immediately below the room I was in. Seeing that it was still dark outside, I checked the time on the cell phone on the nightstand, and my first reaction was to assume that a party-goer had backed into one of our cars as it was trying to get out of our street. Before I went downstairs, however, I walked around the foot of the bed to the only window in my bedroom, which happened to look right down over the front door and the front steps, just to make sure that someone was really there. I saw a man in a yellow Oxford shirt, button-down collar, and beige trousers. His arm was raised as if he had just rapped on the door. Yes, it's 3:30. That's the time, Sue. So the man had graying hair, which seemed to be in a crew cut, and his overall appearance was that of a man from the 1950s. I had the distinct impression he had been at the neighbor's party, but when I looked at the street, it seemed that all the other cars were gone. It was dark. It was empty. Puzzled, I took the stairs down and I went to the front door to see what the man needed. In all, it really couldn't have taken me more than 10 seconds to get down there because the bedroom sits at the very top of the stairs and the stairs end in the foyer, steps from the front door. But when I got downstairs and opened the front door, there was nobody. When I turned on the porch lights, there was still nobody to be seen. and our front yard is big enough that I should have been able to see the man walking away if he was still anywhere in the vicinity. But as it was, he was gone, apparently vanished into thin air. Immediately, I tried to rationalize the situation, telling myself that I still must have been half asleep and that because I had taken so long coming down the stairs, the man at the front door must have given up and left. But I was left with an uneasy feeling nonetheless. I looked at the grandmother clock ticking away in its new location nearby, and my mind went back to all those nights during the first year at La Casa Fabulosa when I found myself awake in the early morning hours trying to figure out what was going on. So there's a good break to take a drink and toast. Thanks everyone for joining us on the last night of reading Voodoo Days at La Casa Fabulosa. Say hi, let people know where you're from, let us know what you're drinking. I'm doing my vodka gimlet. Oh yeah, by the way, Laura Tanner, she sent me some pictures last night. She saw like one of these books over here. She said like tipped on its side or something, and she sent pictures and it looks like the book's moved. But several nights, so this is night 17, several nights before, people told me they saw like a book move, or one night someone thought they saw my niece's picture move. So Laura, I think she's going to share the pictures that she took last night. She has an arrow, she kind of points it out, and it looks like, yeah, one of the books did move or something. So I might have to go back and look at all the other previous nights, see if we had any moving books or anything. Okay, so we got a couple more pages, so, but we're getting there, people. Get your hankies ready, all right? So the place we live in today is an airy limestone house built in 1946. It's not as large or opulent as La Casa Fabulosa, but it's big enough and more than comfortable. There are great picture windows in the main spaces, and one of my favorite things about the house is that there's a library tucked away behind a door hidden in the north wall of the living room. I've got most of my books in there, and a lot of my favorite things, and it's where I do most of my writing nowadays, although I do like to spend my free mornings at Days, a local coffee house. There are window boxes full of red geraniums at the new house, and although it's in the city, it sits on a lot with large trees that provide shade, and it makes it feel like we're in the country at times. The yard is much bigger than the one on 3rd Street, but it's not really that nice. While most of the lawns in this neighborhood are tidy and manicured, ours is kind of a mess. In some parts, there are too many tree roots and shade for grass to grow, and in parts where there is grass, there are mold tracks and burrows all over the place. Ramon wants to get poison to get rid of the molds, but I haven't had the heart to do it yet, and I keep managing to put it off. I convince him to put it off too. I don't think some of the neighbors appreciate this though, because the other day a guy walking by with his dog gave me the stink eye when he looked into the yard and saw all of the mole ruts. I'm sure he wouldn't approve of the fact that I'm always throwing scraps of food out into the backyard instead of into the trash either. I figure, why throw away out anything edible when there are creatures who will eat it? So at night, the possums and the fat raccoons in the neighborhood come out and they scamper through our backyard to root through the piles of scraps I leave for them, and I feel like I've done something useful in feeding somebody. I still love cooking today, and it seems that I'm always testing and developing new recipes to try out on my friends and family. Eventually, I went on to write 3 cookbooks and a restaurant guide for Kentucky. But in the meantime, I've given up the food writing for a while, because every time I wrote a cookbook, it seemed I'd gain at least 20 pounds from all the sampling and the recipe testing. And with every new book, it kept getting harder and harder to lose the weight afterwards. I cook all the time, and I love having people over. Whenever I can, I still frequent my favorite restaurants in Old Louisville. Several years ago, someone purchased Juanita's Burger Boy, and they really cleaned it up. The ambience is definitely less seedy now, but the food hasn't really changed, and it's still open 24 hours a day, so it's a great hangout if I ever find myself wide awake at 3 in the morning and in need of a cup of coffee or a place to write. They also cleaned up the tavern and really spruced up the menu to boot, but they're not open 22 hours a day anymore. As a result, it's hard to find the same mix of night owls, drag queens, and salty locals that used to be the norm. Nonetheless, it's still a great place to pop in for a drink or a knocker burger, and it seems that interesting characters can still be found at the bar every now and then. The other day, I was there for a meeting, and I saw a figure hulked over the bar. Although the person wasn't in drag, much less wearing a black leather leotard like that Halloween night in Eastern Cemetery, I could have sworn it was one of Mama Wawa's acolytes. Eastern Cemetery, by the way, has undergone some changes as well, and for the better. In 2013, a local man by the name of Andy Harpole started the Friends of Eastern Cemetery, a volunteer group that generally meets there on Sundays to keep the place from falling into ruin. They've cleaned up and reset headstones, trimmed and maintained the rough expanse of tangled weeds and overgrowth that dominated most of the green space, and they've done a great job of raising awareness in the city. I keep meaning to go and help out, but Sunday afternoons are usually pretty busy for me, so I haven't been able to do that yet. My friend Sean Stafford is a regular volunteer, though, and he keeps me apprised of the progress they're making. I first met Andy Harpole one day at the courthouse, where he showed up to sit in on one of the first days of a murder trial I was writing about. We got to talking, and he mentioned his plans to start a group dedicated to the preservation of the cemetery, and he also told me about the Stigmatorium, a pet project of his. The Stigmatorium, as it turns out, was a kind of makeshift museum of the macabre set up in his boat restoration business in an old warehouse in Louisville's West End. If you stopped by, you'd find old caskets turned into coffee tables, skulls, funeral art, and any number of pleasantly gruesome artifacts. It's a shame he can't move the whole place to old Louisville. Not to worry, though, because an acquaintance of mine recently opened a similar kind of establishment near the corner of 6th and Oak, not even 2 blocks away from the Witch's Tree. Her name is Kathy Crabb, and she named her shop Unorthodox for obvious reasons. In addition to authentic Victorian witch hunting kits, you can find all kinds of things for the very discerning shopper. 100-year-old moose antlers, lockets filled with dirt from infamous serial killer Ed Gein's grave, a Civil War era bone saw, brothel tokens, embalming fluid bottles, antique baby caskets, nun puppets, a taxidermy rat dressed up as the Pope, things that every respectable household needs. I love it that we have a shop like that in Old Louisville, and I love it even more that Kathy chose Oak Street for the location of her business. Unfortunately, since then, Kathy moved over to Frankfort Avenue, so Unorthodox is still around, but it's not on Oak Street anymore. So cheers, by the way. Although I've moved out of the neighborhood, it seems that I'm in Old Louisville now more than ever. If it's not for a committee meeting or a board meeting for some annual neighborhood event that calls me down to Old Louisville, then it's a tour group or a school group wanting to know more about the neighborhood. The word has really gotten out about Old Louisville, and more people are showing interest in our enchanted neighborhood. Some are coming to visit, others are moving here from other parts of the country, like Carrie Sweet, who moved here from California. She brought a big place over on First Street, and I got to meet her during a photo shoot at her house, which she graciously opened to me and photographers Franklin and Esther Schmidt while we were working on our coffee table book, Old Louisville, Exuberant, Elegant, and Alive. And that's the big coffee table book I used for show and tell a couple nights. I found out that Carrie had read my first ghost books and was a paranormal buff, so she's a regular hangout of mine and has even become a research assistant for one of my most current projects. One day, I received a somewhat mysterious request to give someone a private day tour of the city. And when I showed up at the Seelbach Hotel to meet the guest, it turned out to be none other than the famous filmmaker Baz Luhrmann, who had come to town to scout out potential locations for the new Great Gatsby movie he was directing. In the novel, F. Scott Fitzgerald's Daisy Buchanan character supposedly comes from Louisville, and Luhrmann wanted to explore the parts of town where Daisy would have been seen and what she would have frequented. After touring the lovely Highlands neighborhood where she supposedly lived, we headed into the old Louisville neighborhood, and the director's eyes immediately lit up when he saw the array of old homes and mansions. He had an assistant with him, and they immediately started the camera rolling as we strolled down Millionaire's Row and through Belgravia Court into St. James Court. After stopping in front of the Pink Palace, we continued down the sidewalk past the antique houses, and we came to stop in front of the splashing Venus fountain at the center. After a lengthy silence and a long look around, Lerman nodded his head and slowly said, "This neighborhood is simply enchanting." As we drove back into the downtown area along 4th Street, there was a commotion on the sidewalk as we stopped for the light at the intersection with Oak. I looked over to where a shopkeeper had dozens and dozens of tropical birds, mostly macaws and parrots, on display in a variety of wooden cages and on large perches that seemed to take up half the block. Flapping brightly colored wings, the creatures were squawking and screeching to high heaven at a scuffle on the ground in front of them, where 2 people appeared to be wrestling. One of the figures stood up and broke away from the other, and that's when I saw that it was Beau. He was smiling and in his heavy trench coat despite the July heat, and the other was Tina, her ankle-length bleach blonde hair tousled and in severe disarray as she squealed and tried to convince him to go another round. In the crowd of onlookers, cheering them on, stood Candy, the transvestite I had met the night in Fort George. She had on a flouncy pink summer dress, and next to her stood a rotund man with a bald head and a handlebar mustache, wearing a red and white striped unitard, just like an old-fashioned strongman at the circus. I didn't see any cast-iron barbells, but I'm sure he had to have a set nearby. After years and years of studies and neighborhood meetings, it seems that the corner of 4th and Crazy might finally be getting a much-needed makeover. And very recently, the city invested a good deal of money to improve and beautify the streetscape in that area. There's also been an incredible push to bring in more restaurants and business establishments, and you can already see things starting to turn around. Whether or not this will have any effect on the amount of questionable characters and colorful oddballs who tend to mill around at the corner of 4th and Crazy has yet to be seen, however. The other day I noticed what appeared to be a drug deal going down in broad daylight as I drove by. Two blocks later, after I turned and was passing my old house, I happened to see a figure with a violin case shuffling along the sidewalk. Sure enough, it was none other than Micah Chandler, who, since I first spotted him all those years before, has become a regular fixture in old Louisville, downtown and along Bardstown Road. He is seen frequently in various parts of the city, and his volunteerism and impromptu street performances have made him something of a local icon. People call out as he passes, and he often stops so they can have their pictures taken with him. It's always a hit when one of my tour groups runs into him along the streets of old Louisville. Micah was recently in the news when an unkind soul stole his violin. But by the next day, it was replaced by a Good Samaritan, and Micah was back to his sidewalk concerts as if nothing had happened. I run into Cookie every now and then, usually near the corner of 4th and Crazy, but he's mellowed out over the years. Unfortunately, I don't have to worry about him appearing out of nowhere and grabbing me anymore, although for a number of years he insisted on talking about cookies whenever we came across each other. I eventually consulted a dictionary of urban slang, and just as I had feared, the cookies he was referencing weren't the kind of cookies you bake in an oven. It seems that he still gives me a lewd grin any time we see each other, but we usually don't talk other than to exchange brief greetings. Frances Mengel and I kept in touch, and for several years I was a regular speaking guest at various events for her clubs and organizations. She's still out in the East End and will be pushing 100 in not too long, I'd assume, and we talk once or twice a year. Last month, she was sitting at home when one of my books apparently flew from a shelf and landed at her feet, so she called me to tell me about it. For a couple of years, I would get a weekly call from Loretti, perched high up at her window in the Hillebrand house, and she would tell me about the sundry oddballs and weirdos that she tracked through the neighborhood with her father's World War II-era field glasses. Anytime she saw a possum in the backyard, she would call and inform me as well. Then one day, I realized I hadn't heard from her in almost a month. Anytime the phone rang for the next several months, I would rush to it, hoping to hear Loretti's gravelly voice and the tinkle of ice cubes and bourbon on the other end, but I never heard from her again. Although she had never told me her last name, I probably could have found out and tracked down some information about what happened to her, but I was afraid at what I might discover. Every time now I pass the Hillebrand house, I always look up and imagine her sitting at the window, keeping watch over the neighborhood. Although throughout most of the year, we now offer guided walking tours of the neighborhood, And not too long ago, the New York Times named my tours as one of the things not to miss during a visitor's 36 hours in Louisville. Daily at 11 a.m. and 1 p.m. there's a history and architecture tour, and then at 7:30 there's a tour of America's most haunted neighborhood, our most popular tour. The tour is based on my 11th book, True Ghost Stories and Eerie Legends from America's Most Haunted Neighborhood, which is a compilation of the most popular stories and legends from my previous ghost book. Did we cut out for a bit? I got a little bit of static. All right. So in case we cut out that last little bit, let me read that last paragraph. So throughout most of the year, we offer guided walking tours of the neighborhood. And not too long ago, the New York Times named my tours as one of the things not to miss during a visitor's 36 hours in Louisville. Daily at 11 a.m. and 1 p.m. there's a history and architecture tour. And then at 7:30 p.m. there's a tour of America's most haunted neighborhood, our most popular tour. This tour is based on my 11th book, True Ghost Stories and Eerie Legends from America's Most Haunted Neighborhood, which is a compilation of the most popular stories and legends from my previous ghost books, which have been edited and updated. One of the stops on this tour is a large house at 1435 South 4th Street, just a few blocks away from La Casa Fabulosa, which has become the subject of a recent writing project. Carrie Sweet has been invaluable as a confidant and research assistant on this book. The house in question was built around 1899 for the family of Richard Robinson, and for many years it sat largely ignored by the residents of Old Louisville. But that all changed the evening of June 17, 2010. That night, around 9:30, a call was made from the house to 911. The caller was Jeffrey Munt, a local man who had recently moved back to the Louisville area and who had purchased the large mansion with the intent of turning it into a bed and breakfast. Shortly after moving into the house, he had met Joseph Banis through an online hookup site, and the two became a couple. The night of the 911 call, however, things were a bit rocky for them, and Jeffrey told the 911 operator that he was locked in a bedroom on the second floor and that Joseph was outside with a hammer trying to break down the door so he could kill him. When police arrived a short time later and arrested Joseph Banis, everybody thought that would be the end of the matter. But Joseph Banis began talking, and the claim he made was a startling one. A man, he said, had been murdered the year before, sometime in early December, and he was buried in the basement. Although they didn't believe him at first, detectives started to take Banis seriously when they discovered that Jamie Carroll, the alleged victim, had been missing for the last half year or so, and people in the eastern part of the state where he was from were looking for him. When officers returned later that night with a search warrant, they found a large plastic storage container under several feet of dirt in the basement. In it was the body of James Carroll, who had been shot and stabbed. A sledgehammer had been used to fit his body into the container. Known as Jamie to many of his friends, Carroll was a hairdresser from eastern Kentucky who also performed as a drag queen by the name of Ronica Reed. Banis and Munt were both charged with the murder of James Carroll, but both insisted that the other was responsible. 3 years later, in 2013, Joseph Banis and Jeffrey Munt had their days in court, each in separate trials where they testified one against the other. In March, a jury convicted Banis for the murder of Jamie Carroll and several other charges. In May, a jury acquitted Jeffrey Munt of the most serious charges. For his part in the crime, Munt received an 8-year sentence. Banis was sentenced to 20 years to life. But there's much more to that story. As more details emerged, it was revealed that drugs, kinky sex, and counterfeit money were also involved. In addition, the large house where the murder occurred has a slightly spooky past, and for a time in the early 1900s, it doubled as a sanatorium. Not only that, the negative publicity threw Old Louisville into the spotlight, and many were left with an unpleasant taste in their mouths after the soft underbelly of the neighborhood was exposed. Carol Baskin did not kill her husband. Stop that, Jenna. Don't even bring Carol Baskin into this. All right. Of course, I saw the potential for another book in this old house, and the working title is The House in Old Louisville. After 2 years of research, I finally got down to the actual writing, but it's been slow going, and I don't foresee the book nearing completion for another 2 years. In the meantime, I will keep writing about the neighborhood and telling anyone who will listen why I think it's such a special place. I think she got a bad rap too, Justin Davis. In the meantime, I will keep writing about the neighborhood and telling anyone who will listen why I think it's such a special place, an enchanted neighborhood despite its imperfections. On nights when people sign up for our ghost walk of the neighborhood, I regale visitors with stories from my most favorite houses in old Louisville. They hear about the Conrad Caldwell House, the Pink Palace, and the somewhat hidden areas like Fountain Court. One of the stops is the old house where Jamie Carroll met his tragic end, and which was recently purchased and lovingly restored. When the tour goer hears the details of the murder and the subsequent trials, his or her eyes always grow wide with disbelief, and this disbelief generally turns into fascination when they discover more about the house's strange history. Perhaps it's because the details are so fresh in the local memory, or maybe it's because they're so bizarre, but for whatever reason, the house in old Louisville has generated a lot of buzz, and people are looking forward to the book. I kind of envision it as a Louisville version of John Barron's wonderful book Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, with a touch of Truman Capote's In Cold Blood thrown in for good measure. Like I said, it's going to be a while before the book is finished anyway, and in the meantime, I have to figure out how to come up with a story that tells the truth while not coming off as overly gruesome and sensational. Toward the end of the evening tour, we always stroll down 3rd Street before heading back to Central Park. One of the last stops is La Casa Fabulosa. Standing in front of the old house, I give the tour goers a brief rundown of the history of the building and point out some of its architectural features. Then I tell them it's where I used to live, and that for the first year in the house, would-be paranormal events seemed to be a regular occurrence. Footsteps in the middle of the night, the grandmother clock chiming 13 o'clock, strange smells, and things moving of their own accord. When it comes to the oddballs in the neighborhood, I usually avoid these details, nor do I tell them that there was a time when witches and gypsies could be found in the neighborhood, and that for a while I thought a voodoo woman was chasing me. I figure they can find out these things on their own, so I tell them old Louisville is a place that holds lots of secrets. All it takes is a little curiosity and the desire to scratch the thin veneer between the past and the present before an enchanted neighborhood starts to reveal itself. It's an enchanted place full of old houses and history, one with its fair share of oddballs and oddities as well. I encourage them to come back and explore on their own, and then the group makes its way back. As we leave, I always turn and smile at the fading facade of La Casa Fabulosa. All these years later, and the hedge around the small front yard has finally grown and filled out so that now it towers over me. I make sure to reach out and brush it with my hand as I walk away. And that's the end of La Casa Fabulosa. So thanks for tuning in tonight, people. 17 nights, 2 weeks and a half. We met every night and worked our way through this. So thanks for being loyal tuner-inners, and thanks to those who have tuned in since the very first night, and thanks to those who are watching, if they can't watch it live, going back and watching it. Share these with your friends if you would. Save them on your pages. The more saves we get, the more comments, the more good publicity we're generating for old Louisville. So, like I said, not quite sure, but I think tomorrow night I'll probably start to read the first couple pages of The House in Old Louisville, the actual true crime book, which, like I said, is probably going to be called Murder in Glitterball City. So I can probably get 2 or 3 nights out of that, and then I'll try to read something else. Maybe give you a preview of my old Louisville murder mystery, the one where Poo Poo Chiffon, the drag queen, is the heroine. So I'm going to call it a night. I got a pizza just coming out of the oven, so thank you very, very much, and love you all, and thanks for being my friends on Facebook and in real life. So I will see you all tomorrow night, and I look forward to reading the comments for tonight. So take care, and have a good night, everyone.